Hi there. Tonight we walk barefoot through a quiet museum of time, where clay tablets sit under soft light like sleeping animals, and every tiny wedge mark feels like a heartbeat pressed into mud. You are there in your mind, breathing slow, listening to the hush, while the ancient city air seems to rise from the clay itself, warm and dusty and strangely alive. Most of what you hear tonight is built on widely accepted history, the real Sumerian world of scribes, temples, and kings. Some parts are interpretation, because translation is careful work and scholars debate meanings. And some parts are calm, cinematic, what-if imagination, because it is bedtime and you deserve a little mystery without anyone pretending it is a courtroom verdict. Also, fair warning, you probably won't survive this, meaning you will absolutely fall asleep at the worst possible moment and wake up thinking you can read cuneiform. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments, because I love picturing this story, drifting across different nights. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in a long hallway of the mind, and the air tastes faintly of old paper and cool stone. In front of you is not paper, though it is clay, a small tablet, palm-sized, the color of baked bread crust, and stamped with neat lines of tiny wedges. This is the Sumerian world as we actually know it, not the movie version with dramatic thunder every time someone says a god's name. Most historians agree that people in southern Mesopotamia, in cities like Uruk and Ur, developed one of the earliest writing systems we can identify as cuneiform. Archaeology suggests these cities were real places with real streets, temples, workshops, and administrative buildings. The evidence we do have points to an enormous amount of daily record keeping: grain, sheep, beer, labor, debts. If you ever feel like modern life is too bureaucratic, just know that 4,000 years ago somebody was already counting goats and getting stressed about it. You lean closer. The wedges look like a code, but also like art. Some are sharp, some shallow, some broken where the clay chipped long ago. And that is where tonight's new Decode feeling comes in. Not a magical decoder ring, not a secret organization sliding envelopes under doors. Just the quiet fact that translation is always a work in motion. Tablets get re-examined. Fragments get rejoined. A sign once read one way gets reconsidered in a different context. A careful reading might suggest a different verb, a different tense, a different mood. And in that shift, the story can tilt. If the phrase you came for is on the run, let's treat it gently. We are not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. So, solid ground first. Sumerian tablets come in many genres: administrative lists, royal inscriptions, hymns, myths, letters, legal texts, omen collections. Most historians agree that a lot of early writing served temples and palaces, because those institutions had the resources and the need to track goods and people. The scribes were trained. They copied lists of signs, practiced standard phrases, and learned how to make a living by turning reality into marks. You can almost hear the stylus tapping, soft, rhythmic, like rain on a window. You imagine a scribe seated cross-legged, a tray of clay at his side, smoothing a tablet with one hand, pressing wedges with the other. He's not thinking about aliens. He's thinking about deadlines. He's thinking about the temple steward breathing down his neck, asking where the barley is. That is mainstream history, the grounded stuff. And yet, in the same writing culture, there are stories where gods walk, argue, bless, punish, and disappear. Here is where the name Anunnaki enters, and it enters in a way that is both famous and, honestly, often oversold. Most historians agree that the terms Anunna and Anunnaki appear in Mesopotamian literature as a group of deities, often associated with divine assemblies and the underworld in later traditions. Their roles shift across time, languages, and regions. That shifting is important, because it means you cannot freeze the word like a screenshot and claim it always means one single thing. Scholars continue to debate nuances, and that is not a weakness. That is how you treat ancient evidence with respect. Now you step onto the misty ground, carefully. A new decode, or rather a new interpretation built from careful philology, might emphasize certain phrases that sound like movement. Withdrawal, departure, dispersal. Sometimes these are formulaic, sometimes poetic, sometimes broken by gaps in the tablet. It's possible that in some contexts, the language of God's leaving is symbolic. A more cautious explanation could be that it reflects a change in cult practice, or a city's political decline, or a shift in which deity is considered present and powerful. But tonight's theme is the sensation of flight. The idea that the Anunnaki, whatever they are in the text, seem to be pulling away, slipping from the center, not standing tall on the temple roof like a billboard. So you look at certain verbs and phrases that can be translated as to go out, to depart, to abandon, to be driven away, or even to scatter, depending on the sign and context. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Those meanings are possible ranges, not a single fixed label. To be clear, this is debated, and the excitement often comes from how a translator chooses among plausible options. Imagine a line in a hymn where a city laments. The temple is quiet. The offerings feel unanswered. The people say, in effect, our patron has turned away. In mainstream terms, this is a theological expression of crisis. In interpretive terms, you might hear it as a coded description of something practical, like the removal of a cult statue for safety, or the collapse of a temple economy, or a political takeover that swaps one god's prominence for another. And in bedtime imagination, you let the line breathe into a cinematic what if. What if the gods themselves are portrayed as evacuating, as if they fear something, as if they cannot hold the walls anymore? You walk out of the museum hallway and into a reconstructed street of the mind. Mud brick walls, a reed mat door. The air smells like river water and smoke. A dog watches you from a patch of shadow, judging you, because dogs have been doing that since the beginning of time. You pass a temple platform, and you sense the place where the city's identity lives. In Sumerian life, temples were not just spiritual. They were economic engines. They held land, employed workers, stored grain, organized festivals. What's broadly accepted is that a city's well-being was intertwined with the favor of its gods. Now you step into a temple courtyard at dusk. Torches flicker. Priests move like quiet silhouettes. There is a low chant, steady and sleepy, like a lullaby written for stone. And then, in the text world, you encounter a moment of rupture. A line that suggests withdrawal. The city speaks of its divine assembly dispersing. The words might not say the Anunnaki ran, not literally in your modern slang. But the mood can tilt towards something like that, especially when the text emphasizes absence, silence, or sudden movement. This is where you keep your balance. There is the documented truth ladder rung. Documented is that the texts exist, the signs exist, the gods' names exist, the historical cities exist. Interpreted is how we connect those signs into sentences, and how we understand metaphors about divine presence. Imagined is the chase scene you can taste at the back of your mind when you hear "they departed" and you picture hurried footsteps. So you follow the clue without turning it into a conclusion. You ask a calm question. Why would a text portray gods as leaving? One interpretation is that it reflects a real historical pattern where cities were sacked, elites displaced, and cult centers disrupted. When a city fell, its temple could be plundered, statues could be taken, people could be deported. In the ancient imagination, that could be described as the deity leaving, or being captured, or withdrawing. Historians still argue whether some collapses and political transitions in Mesopotamia are best explained primarily by external invasion, internal conflict, environmental pressure, or some blend that shifts from case to case. And because the causes are debated, the stories that arise from them can be layered and complicated. You keep walking. You notice how the city's sounds change when danger is near. Fewer laughs, more hurried sandals, more doors shutting. Someone whispers a prayer. Someone counts jars twice because fear makes you forget whether you already counted the jars. That is the most ancient human behavior imaginable. Panic math. It never ends. Somewhere. A scribe steadies his hand and keeps writing anyway, because record-keeping does not stop just because your world is wobbling. Now a gentle cinematic possibility drifts in. What if the texts are not only metaphors? What if some are also memories of evacuations? Archaeology suggests that rivers shifted, canals silted, and drought cycles affected agriculture in parts of Mesopotamia across long periods. If a city's fields failed, people moved. If water routes changed, trade changed. And the religious language might describe that movement in divine terms, because the gods were the grammar of meaning. So the gods departed could be a way to say, our life left with them. But the phrase Anunnaki on the run tempts you to picture something more dramatic. So you let yourself picture it, carefully labeled as imagination. You imagine the Anunnaki not as shining sci-fi astronauts, but as the tablet's own kind of beings, divine officials in a cosmic court. They are summoned, consulted, seated, dismissed. And now, in a story mood, the court feels unsettled. There is a new pressure, a new fear. The assembly disperses like birds startled from a reed bed. In the courtyard, you hear a distant drum, or maybe it is your ceiling fan, turning the air into a soft ocean sound. Either way, the rhythm matches the idea of urgency. You picture temple attendants folding cloth, tying cords, packing ritual items, not because they are thieves, but because they are caretakers. In mainstream history, we know sacred objects mattered. In interpretive history, moving them could be an act of protection, a decision by priesthood and rulers. In bedtime imagination, it becomes a quiet getaway, torches hooded, footsteps soft, the god's presence wrapped in linen and lifted onto a cart. And here is a small joke to keep your brain from spiraling too hard. You imagine the divine assembly doing a head count like, is everyone here? Did anyone forget their sacred emblem? And one god is patting their robe pockets like they lost their keys. Ancient panic math, divine addition. Still, you come back to the clay, because the clay is honest. It holds both the certainty and the gaps. Fragments are missing, lines are broken, signs are ambiguous. A translator can be confident in one part and cautious in another. This theory isn't widely accepted, but some modern fringe readings try to push the Anunnaki into a literal extraterrestrial frame, and then interpret departure as a physical escape from pursuit. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood exercise. What if the story is pointing at something else? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So you stand at a crossroads of meanings. On one side, the grounded explanation, divine departure as metaphor for political loss, cult disruption, or theological grief. On the other side, the interpretive possibility. Some texts may preserve memories of movement, the relocation of cult centers, the shifting of power amongst cities, and the human tendency to describe history as the travel of gods, and hovering above like a soft cinematic cloud, the what if, a chase you cannot document, but can imagine in a bedtime safe way. You take a slow breath. The clay smell is still there, warm and earthy. Your fingertips trace the air above the wedges, not touching, just hovering, as if you might feel meaning through distance. And you notice something else. Even in the most mainstream reading, the gods are not static. They travel in stories. They meet, they argue, they withdraw, they return. The texts are alive with movement, and that is the key new development for tonight. Without repeating anything, and without locking it into certainty. A new decode, in the sober sense, might highlight how often the language of departure shows up when cities are anxious, when rulers plead, when temples lament, when the sky is red for signs. That does not force you to believe in a literal manhunt in the heavens. It simply invites a different emotional angle. The divine world in these texts can feel, at times, like it is backing away from the human world. You walk past a canal. The water reflects stars. Somewhere. A reed flute plays a few notes, thin and sweet. You picture a scribe finishing a line and blowing gently on the clay to dry it, like a baker cooling bread. Another small joke slides in, because your brain likes snacks. You think? If someone told the scribe his work would someday be debated by people with podcasts, he would probably ask what a podcast is, then demand royalties in barley. You return to the question in your own quiet way. If the Anunnaki are on the run, what are they running from? In mainstream history, the likely answer is not a cosmic enemy. It is the human experience of instability, floods, drought, war, political shifts, the fall of dynasties, the rise of new powers. Those pressures can be narrated as divine drama, In interpretive terms, the texts might be echoing specific crises, perhaps moments when cult statues were moved, when ritual calendars broke, when temple staff dispersed. And in imagined terms, you let the night sky become a stage, where even gods seem to hesitate at the edge of darkness. You do not need to solve it. Tonight is not about solving. Tonight is about walking beside the clay and listening to its careful, half-broken voice. The wedge marks do not shout. They murmur. They suggest. They leave space. And you, drifting toward sleep, can hold that space without forcing it to become a single answer. You step out of the museum hush and into a living city made of sun-baked brick, where the streets are narrow enough that your shoulders almost brush the walls. The air is warm, heavy with cooking smoke and the sour, sweet smell of beer mash. Somewhere nearby, somebody is arguing about rations, which is a sound that truly spans all of human history. A donkey brays like it is giving a speech to the sky, and you think, yes, that is exactly what politics sounds like. Even in 3000 BCE, most historians agree that Sumerian city life is organized around temples and palaces, and that those institutions are not just spiritual symbols, but real administrative centers. The evidence we do have points to extensive systems of accounting, labor organization, and redistribution of goods. And here is the new angle that keeps you awake just long enough to enjoy it. If you read the Anunnaki, not as mysterious invaders, but as a kind of divine committee, then the language of them being unsettled starts to feel like a story about governance itself. The gods look less like monsters in the clouds and more like a stressed office staff trying to keep the building from flooding. You walk toward a temple courtyard where scribes sit beneath an awning, their reed pens tucked behind ears the way modern people tuck a pencil. Clay tablets rest on their knees. Some are small and quick, like receipts. Some are larger, more formal, like announcements carved into the world. You notice how the scribes do not look mystical. They look tired. Their hands are dusty. Their posture is careful. Because a mistake on a tablet is not as easy to delete as a typo on your phone. A scribe presses wedges into clay with a practiced rhythm. Tap, press, lift, tap again. It is almost hypnotic, like a metronome designed specifically to lull you into sleep. You watch him seal a tablet with a cylinder seal, rolling it across the surface so a tiny carved scene repeats. A king or a priest, a mythic creature, a god symbol. In mainstream terms, this is documentation. In interpretive terms, this is branding. In bedtime imagination, it is the ancient version of a signature that says, yes, this message belongs to the temple. And no, you cannot pretend you never received it. Now the city itself becomes part of the Decode. A popular rumor claims that hidden lines in certain texts are like secret messages. But that idea often ignores how loudly public and practical most writing is. Still, it's possible that the emotional tone of a text is a kind of message in its own right. Not secret, but layered. When a hymn complains that a deity has turned away, the people hearing it are also hearing a civic announcement. Something is wrong. The social engine is sputtering. The storehouses feel thinner. The leadership feels nervous. You follow the sound of water to a canal. Barges drift by, carrying reeds, timber, baskets. A boatman calls out prices. A child laughs. A goat tries to climb onto something it absolutely should not climb onto. which is basically a goat's entire personality. You watch a woman fill jars at the water's edge. She glances at you like she has seen strangers before, but never one's dressed like a sleep-deprived modern listener drifting through time. You decide not to explain, because how do you explain? You just nod politely, as if you belong here. Fake it till you become history. What's broadly accepted is that these cities are connected by trade and by rivalry. Power shifts between them. Dynasties rise and fall. A temple that is rich in one generation might be struggling in the next. And this is where one interpretation is that the Anunnaki, as a group label, can be used flexibly by different communities to describe divine authority. In other words, the word can function like a stamp of legitimacy. If the stamp moves, if the assembly is described as dispersing, it might be reflecting a transfer of political weight. The divine council is a mirror for the human council. You walk toward a large building, not quite palace, not quite temple, but something in between. Officials step in and out carrying tablets. Their belts hold small pouches for seals. A runner passes you with a bundle of reeds, face serious, like he is late for the most important meeting of his life. In mainstream history, there are real texts that show how tightly organized labor can be. Workers assigned, days counted, outputs measured. The system is precise in a way that makes you respect it, and also makes you want to take a nap, which is perfect for bedtime. Now imagine the Anunnaki as the divine version of this system. Not necessarily literal beings you can point to, but a narrative device representing the highest level of cosmic management. When the stories say the gods gather, decide, decree, they are doing what rulers and councils do. When the stories suggest the gods withdraw, it can feel like an institutional failure, a breakdown of the top-level authority. The world's managers are stepping away from their desks. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That is an interpretation, not a certainty. It's possible that some authors simply used poetic language to intensify drama. It's also possible that different texts use the group name differently across centuries. Scholars continue to debate those nuances. And the debate matters because it keeps you from turning a single word into a single destiny. Still, the mood of being on the run can be reframed into something more believable and still eerie, instead of a chase through space. You can picture an administrative panic. A city hears rumors of conflict. Supply lines feel threatened. The temple stewards begin to reorganize. Who guards the storehouses? Who moves the archives? Who escorts the cult objects if relocation becomes necessary? In this reading, the gods leaving is the most dramatic way to say. The old order is evacuating. Historians still argue whether certain major disruptions in Mesopotamian history were mostly sudden shocks or slow, grinding stress. And that argument matters here. If change is slow, divine withdrawal can be described as gradual fading. If change is sudden, it can be described as flight. The same kind of event, seen through different eyes, becomes different language. You step into a scribal school, a small room with benches and trays of clay. A young student is practicing sign lists, repeating the same wedge patterns until his hand learns them the way your hand once learned to write your name. He glances up at you with the exhausted expression of someone who has homework made of mud. You want to reassure him that one day people will think he is cool. Unfortunately, you cannot, because he would not believe you, and also because his teacher looks like he could throw a tablet like a frisbee with terrifying accuracy. A teacher points at a line on a practice tablet. He corrects a sign. The student sighs. The teacher sighs too. This is a second joke, because it is funny and also gently sad. You realize that education has always been a shared suffering agreement between generations. In the corner, you notice a different kind of tablet, not a list, but a composition, a hymn, perhaps. Its language is more elaborate, less numerical. Here, gods are praised, cities are personified, emotions are amplified. If a modern translator revisits such a tablet and sees a verb that could be read as to withdraw rather than to travel, the entire emotional meaning can change. The evidence we do have points to the fact that many tablets are damaged, and that restoration is sometimes a best fit guess based on parallels. That does not make it fake. It makes it human scholarship. And human scholarship is where your bedtime mystery lives. Now you walk to a city gate as the light shifts toward night. Guards stand with spears, posture relaxed but watchful. Beyond the gate is open land, fields, canals, distant marsh. A caravan approaches, slow and dusty. Traders lead donkeys laden with goods. A local official meets them, and you see the tiny dance of authority. Questions, answers, seals. The city is a machine, and the gate is one of its gears. Here is a new development for your story brain. If the Anunnaki are invoked as a group in contexts about judgment, fate, or decrees, then describing them as absent can feel like a crisis of law itself. Imagine living in a world where justice is not just a court decision, but a cosmic alignment. If the divine judges are not seated, who decides? If the assembly is scattered, what holds the city's moral order together? In mainstream terms, this is theology. In interpretive terms, it is social anxiety encoded as myth. In bedtime imagination, it is the unsettling feeling of looking at an empty throne room. A fringe idea proposes that ancient writers were describing literal beings who left suddenly under pressure from an unknown threat. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the language of divine withdrawal is so vivid. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a useful flashlight. It highlights the intensity of fear and change in the human record. It makes you ask what pressures made people describe their world this way. You walk along the inside of the city wall. You pass a small shrine with offerings, bread and dates, maybe a cup of beer. A woman whispers a prayer, not loud enough to be public, but sincere enough to feel heavy in the air. That prayer is another piece of mainstream reality. People prayed because they needed stability. They prayed because crops mattered. They prayed because illness happened. They prayed because politics was unpredictable, and the rivers did what they wanted. The sky darkens. Stars appear one by one. You look up, and the city's noise softens into a low hum. That hum, if you listen to it, could sound like your fan at home. It could sound like distant ocean. It could sound like a giant creature breathing. And in that soft night, the idea of gods being on the run becomes less a tabloid headline and more a mood of withdrawal. The highest powers feel distant. The lights in the cosmic office building are turning off. And now, a third small joke, because you deserve one more. You imagine a divine clerk flipping a sign on the door that says, "Back soon," and then never coming back, which is honestly the most relatable myth you have ever heard. You continue walking until you find a quiet place near the temple, where the stones hold the day's warmth. You sit, you listen. The city continues without you. Somewhere, a scribe finishes a tablet and sets it aside to dry. Somewhere, an official checks a seal impression. Somewhere, a priest prepares tomorrow's offering. And somewhere in the language of myth, the divine assembly feels unsettled, described in verbs that can sound like retreat if you lean into that reading. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. To be clear, this is debated. But the new development is that the on-the-run feeling may not be about a single dramatic escape. It may be about the way ancient people described institutional instability. When the human world shakes, the divine world in the text shakes too. And that is a kind of chase scene you can actually believe, because it is the chase between order and chaos, written in clay, pressed by a tired hand, under a sky that never stops watching. You walk to the edge of a river that refuses to sit still, a wide brown ribbon sliding past reeds and low banks, carrying silt like a slow secret. The water smells green and alive, and the air is cool enough to raise tiny bumps on your arms. A few boats drift near the shore, their hulls dark with pitch, their sides worn smooth by hands that have done this 1,000 times. The river is not a backdrop here. It is the city's bloodstream. It feeds fields, fills jars, moves cargo, and sometimes, when it feels moody, it rearranges the entire map like it is redecorating. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian settlements lived with cycles of flooding, shifting channels, and the constant need to manage water through canals and levees. Most historians agree that these rivers shaped where cities rose, where they struggled, and how they remembered disaster. You stand there listening to the lap of water, and you begin to understand how a text might talk about gods leaving, not because a spaceship took off, but because the land itself forced people to move. The evidence we do have points to floods showing up both in physical layers and in stories. Those two things are not identical, but they can echo each other. A flood layer in the ground is a real event of sediment and damage. A flood story in a tablet is a shaped memory, a mythic language for vulnerability. One interpretation is that when a community experiences evacuation, it may later describe that upheaval as the withdrawal of divine protection. The gods did not literally pack bags, but the feeling was the same. The familiar center became unsafe. You step closer to a boat tied to a post. The rope creaks softly, and the boat nudges the bank like it is impatient. A boatman squints at the sky. He does not look like a romantic sailor. He looks like someone who knows exactly how annoying river mud is. He spits to the side, shakes his head, and mutters about water levels the way modern people mutter about traffic. You try not to laugh, but you do, quietly. Joke number 1. Even the ancient world has the same basic soundtrack. People complaining about conditions they cannot control. You follow a dirt path along the canal, and you see fields laid out like a patchwork quilt. A few workers stand knee-deep in water, guiding flow with a shovel, nudging the river into obedience, one small channel at a time. This is mainstream life. It is physical and practical. And yet, the texts that survive are filled with gods, because gods are how this world talks about forces bigger than any one person. If the river behaves, the gods are pleased. If the river misbehaves, the gods are angry, distant, or silent. Now the new development takes shape as a specific kind of scene, one that fits the on-the-run mood without needing cosmic villains. Imagine a season when the river rises too high, or shifts its channel, or breaches a levee at night. People wake to water licking the threshold. They lift children. They grab jars. They try to save grain. They herd animals toward higher ground. In that chaos, priests and temple officials face a different decision. What do you do with the sacred objects that define your city? Most historians agree that temple cult statues and ritual objects were central to Mesopotamian religious life. The statue is not just decoration. It is treated as the deity's presence in a tangible form. A more cautious explanation could be that when texts describe a god going or leaving, it sometimes reflects the physical movement of that cult statue. In other words, the god travels because the statue travels, not as a modern metaphor, but as a ritual reality. You step into a temple storeroom where the air is cooler and smells of cedar and linen. A priest unties a bundle carefully, like he's unwrapping a sleeping baby. Another priest checks a list on a tablet, scanning lines with his finger. A scribe stands nearby, stylus ready, documenting what is taken and what remains. The urgency is quiet, which is a special kind of urgency. No screaming, just fast hands and tight mouths. It's possible that some Sumerian and later Mesopotamian compositions preserve this atmosphere. Laments where a city cries out that its god has abandoned it. Prayers asking a deity to return. Lines where a divine assembly is said to disperse, or where a deity is said to go out from the temple. The verbs can be read in multiple ways, depending on context and damage. But in the flood and evacuation frame, the language becomes chillingly ordinary. The gods are on the run in the sense that the people are on the run, and they carry the gods with them. Historians still argue whether certain flood traditions should be read mainly as memory of local events, as symbolic theology, or as literary motifs shared across cultures. That debate keeps the ground steady under your feet. It reminds you that a story can be inspired by reality without being a news report. It also reminds you that a river does not need to flood the whole world to flood your world. Outside, you hear the thud of feet on packed earth. The courtyard is filling with people. Some carry bundles, some carry baskets, some carry nothing at all. Which is the saddest luggage? A mother holds a child on her hip and looks toward the canal as if trying to judge whether it will rise again. An official speaks with a guard. A boatman waits, face tense, hand on the rope. You walk to the dock as the light turns silver and the wind smells like wet reeds. The boats are ready. And here is the cinematic what if, clearly labelled as imagination. What if, in the minds of the people watching, the departure of boats loaded with sacred objects felt like watching the gods escape? Not escape from aliens, not escape from lasers, but escape from drowning, from chaos, from the collapse of familiar streets. What if the priest's calm chanting was not only prayer, but a way to keep panic from exploding. A careful reading might suggest that some lines about divine departure carry a tone of haste or a tone of compulsion, words that can suggest being driven, being urged, being forced. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Those nuances are not always certain, and translations vary, but the possibility is there. The texts sometimes sound like they are describing an emergency, even when the genre is mythic. You step onto a boat. The wood creaks, and the water makes that soft slapping sound that always feels like a heartbeat. You sit low, because you are trying to be respectful of balance, and also because you are not interested in being the person who tips the sacred cargo into the canal. Joke number 2. You imagine the priest glaring at you like, if you drop the god, you are doing the apology speech to the entire city. The boat pushes off. The shore recedes. The city wall becomes a line. The temple platform stands above the roofs, and in your mind it feels like an eye watching you leave. The rowers pull in unison. Their muscles tighten and release. Their breath is visible in the cool air. A priest murmurs words you do not understand, but you understand the tone. It is steadying. It says, we are still ourselves, even if we are moving. Now you notice the other side of the on the run idea. Running doesn't always mean fear of an enemy. Sometimes it means outrunning a force of nature. The river is not chasing with malice, but it is relentless. It rises because of distant rains, because of melting snows, because of the physics of water in a flat land. The people do not control the cause, but they live with the consequence. When later texts say, the gods turned away, or the gods departed, it can be the emotional truth of surviving that kind of helplessness. You drift past reed beds where birds lift into the air, startled. Their wings make a soft, thrumming sound. The sky is a pale bowl overhead. You see other boats, some loaded with jars, some with animals, some with people sitting still and staring. A child points at the water and laughs, because children are almost offensively resilient. An old man closes his eyes as if listening to something inside himself, and now the mystery portion slips in, about 30% of the flavor, like a spice you taste but cannot name. A fringe idea proposes that references to divine departure and dispersal hint at a hidden crisis beyond environmental events, something like an internal conflict among gods, or a cosmic hierarchy collapsing. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often stretches language beyond what the tablets can firmly support. But if we treat it as a possibility, rather than a conclusion, it becomes an imaginative lens. It asks, what if the myths are dramatizing a real sense of abandonment, as if even the highest powers were not stable? You look up at the stars beginning to appear. They are bright in this flat land, and their stillness feels almost insulting next to the moving water. A popular rumor claims that ancient priests encoded astronomical warnings about great cataclysms. Sometimes those claims are exaggerated. Still, it is documented that Mesopotamian cultures observed the sky carefully and developed sophisticated traditions of omen interpretation. One interpretation is that during times of flood or drought, the sky reading becomes more intense, because people want reasons and warnings. The divine assembly in the heavens becomes a story framework for uncertainty. The boat glides into a wider channel, and the current pulls. The rowers adjust. You feel the subtle shift of speed. the river deciding part of your path. You smell pitch and wet wood and the faint sourness of carried beer. You notice a bundle near your feet, wrapped in cloth and tied with cord. You do not open it, because you are not that kind of tourist. But your imagination does. You picture it holding a small sacred emblem, a symbol that says our God is still with us, even if our city is not. In mainstream history, relocation happened for many reasons, not only floods, political conflict, economic collapse, canal failure, soil salinization, and shifting trade routes could all pressure people to move. Archaeology suggests that some settlements were abandoned while others grew. The landscape is dynamic, so the language of gods traveling can attach to many kinds of movement. A city's patron deity might be said to leave when the city loses power, when a new dynasty promotes a different cult, or when people physically depart. The same motif can carry different historical weights in different contexts. You sit with that complexity, and it calms you instead of stressing you, because bedtime history is not a test. It is a slow river ride through uncertainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. To be clear, this is debated. The boat approaches a higher bank where people have gathered. Fires are being lit. Someone hands out bread. Someone tends to a crying child. A priest steps onto land and turns, lifting his hands in a gesture that feels both practical and sacred, like saying, "Put the cargo here," and also, "Please let us be safe." The officials count bundles. A scribe presses wedges into a fresh tablet, noting what arrived. You watch the writing happen in real time, wet clay taking shape. It is the purest kind of quiet evidence. And then you feel the emotional meaning that might give rise to the on-the-run decode. When your life is forced to move, it feels like running. When your God statue moves with you, it feels like your God is running too, not because the God is weak, but because the world is unstable. That is a human truth that ancient texts can carry without needing any modern sensational framing. Joke number 3 arrives softly. You imagine the scribe finishing the evacuation record and stamping it with a seal that basically says, "Yes, we fled responsibly," which is the ancient version of filling out a form titled "Reason for Leaving, the River Did a Thing." Night settles. The river continues. The fires crackle. The people eat, breathe, and try to sleep. You lie back on the grass and look at the stars. You let the mystery stay a mystery. You do not force it into certainty. You simply let the idea hover, like a lantern on the water. The Anunnaki as a divine assembly, portrayed in some texts as withdrawing, dispersing, or departing. A reflection of a world where even gods can seem to move when the ground itself is moving. You wake into a quiet room of language, not a physical room, but the kind built from names and titles, and the way a single word can change its outfit over centuries. The air feels dry and crisp, like turning pages that are too old to bend easily. In front of you is a tablet fragment, small as a postcard, and the surface is crowded with signs that look similar until you stare long enough to see their tiny differences. A wedge angled slightly left, a stroke deeper than its neighbor, a break that swallows half a line like a bite taken out of a sentence. Most historians agree that the term Anunna or Anunnaki appears in Mesopotamian tradition as a collective label for certain gods, but its exact scope and role can vary by time and text. The evidence we do have points to a long, layered literary tradition, where older Sumerian materials interact with later Akkadian and Babylonian compositions. Names travel, titles shift. A god praised as supreme in one city might be supporting cast in another. This is not chaos. It is culture doing what culture always does, remixing its own greatest hits. You run your finger in the air above the signs, tracing where the cracks cut through the line, and here comes the new development. The feeling that the Anunnaki are on the run can be created not only by dramatic verbs, but by subtler changes in labeling. One interpretation is that when writers swap titles, narrow a group, broaden it, or move it to a different domain, it can feel like the group is being relocated in the imagination, not physically running, but being repositioned, as if someone is shifting them away from the center of power. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are talking about how language frames divine authority, not about a confirmed storyline of fleeing beings. To be clear, this is debated, and different scholars emphasize different patterns. You step into a scribal workshop where the only sound is soft scraping and the occasional sigh. Someone is grinding pigment for a seal impression. Someone is warming clay near a brazier. Someone is reading a line out loud to check rhythm. The words are not casual. They are crafted. And in that crafting, the Anunnaki name becomes a tool. A careful reading might suggest that collective divine labels can function like political vocabulary. Think of how modern people say the administration, or the committee, or the court. The phrase points to a body of authority, not always to a specific list of individuals. In this view, Anunnaki can sometimes feel like the high gods, or the assembly, depending on context. If a text says the assembly dispersed, that could mirror a time when authority itself felt scattered, contested, or relocated. You watch a scribe copy a hymn. He pauses at a damaged section of his source. His eyes narrow. He has choices. He can leave a gap. He can supply a likely sign based on parallel lines he knows by heart. He can choose a synonym that fits the meter. Each choice is careful, but each choice is still a choice. The evidence we do have points to scribal education being highly traditional, but also creative in subtle ways. Even when copying, scribes could standardize, update, or harmonize language. Now imagine how this affects the Anunnaki. A text from one period might call them the divine judges. Another might associate them more with the underworld. Another might treat them as a broad collective of gods. If their role shifts toward the underworld, some modern listeners might interpret that as demotion or exile, like they were pushed underground. That is an interpretation, not a certainty, but it is a real effect of how later traditions can reshape earlier ones. Historians still argue whether shifts in divine hierarchies in Mesopotamia are driven more by theological evolution or by political pressures, such as city rivalries and imperial unification. That argument is not just academic. It is part of how you decide what the story is doing. If it is theology evolving, then the Anunnaki shift is a religious idea changing. If it is politics, then the shift is a reflection of who has power and which cult is promoted. You walk into a temple library space. Shelves of tablets are stacked in baskets, tags of clay hang from cords, labeling groups of texts. It feels like an ancient filing system, and it is oddly comforting. You can almost hear the ancient equivalent of someone saying, "Please put the tablet back where you found it," which is the eternal librarian vibe. Here comes joke number 1. You imagine a scribe losing a tablet, and another scribe whispering. If the administrator finds out, the gods will not be the only ones on the run. The humor is gentle, but the tension behind it is real. The texts are valuable. They are authority. Now you pick up, in your mind, a different kind of clue. Names sometimes get written with determinatives, little signs that indicate category, like, "This is a god name." When those markers appear or disappear, when spellings vary, when a group label is replaced by individual names, it can signal how the writer wants you to think about the divine world. One interpretation is that emphasizing individual gods can make the assembly feel less cohesive, like a council breaking into factions. Again, not literal factions you can prove, but a literary sensation of fragmentation. You step outside into a courtyard where starlight falls on brick. 2 priests speak quietly, their voices low and steady. They are discussing which offerings go to which shrine, which festival comes next, which chant is appropriate. This is mainstream religion as lived practice. It is schedules, bread, incense, and the constant work of keeping meaning stable. Now the mystery spice returns, carefully measured. A fringe idea proposes that name changes and title shifts conceal a deliberate attempt to hide identities, as if ancient writers were covering tracks. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often assumes motives that are difficult to demonstrate from the evidence. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an atmospheric what if. What if some scribes felt pressured to reframe the old divine order because the new order demanded it? What if the gods had to be renamed to fit a new political reality? You walk through an alley where someone is baking flatbread on a hot stone. The smell is so good you almost forget you're supposed to be asleep. You watch the baker slap dough, flip it, stack it. In the corner, a child hums. The city is alive even at night, but softer. Now consider another language angle that keeps this part fresh. Some words in Sumerian and Akkadian have ranges of meaning that overlap with concepts like to send away, to be distant, to withdraw, to remove, if a translator chooses one shade rather than another. The story mood changes. A line that might be rendered as the gods withdrew could also be rendered as the gods were absent, or the gods departed. Each is similar, but each triggers different images in your mind. Absent feels like neglect. Departed feels like travel. Sent away feels like compulsion. And on the run is a modern emotional gloss that turns travel into urgency. Let me rephrase that more carefully. On the run is not an ancient phrase. It is a modern mood applied to ancient verbs. That mood can be useful for storytelling, as long as you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You stop at a small shrine built into a wall. Someone has left a little clay figurine there, rough and simple. This is another mainstream reality. Personal devotion exists alongside official cult. People make small offerings. People ask for protection. People worry about illness, love, harvest, and the moods of the powerful. The divine world is not just top-down, it is intimate. And that intimacy is where the Anunnaki name can feel strange. A group label is distant. It sounds official. It sounds like authority. So if a text suggests that the Anunnaki are not present, it can create a sense that the highest layer of divine governance is missing. The city still has local shrines, still has daily rituals, but the top floor feels dark. That is a new development for the listener's mind. The on-the-run sensation becomes not a chase, but a vacancy at the peak. Joke number 2 slides in. You imagine the Divine Council as an office building with the lights off and a note on the door that says, "Out for lunch." And the lunch has lasted 3 centuries. Not terrifying, just mildly inconvenient for anyone hoping for cosmic clarity. You wander into a hall where a singer practices a lament. Her voice is low, vibrating in your chest. The words speak of a city's sorrow, of walls that cannot protect, of a patron who does not answer. Most historians agree that city laments are a real genre in Mesopotamian literature, expressing communal grief and theological reflection. One interpretation is that these laments encode historical trauma, such as invasions or political collapse. Into religious language, historians still argue whether specific laments refer to precise historical events or to broader patterns of destruction and restoration repeated across time. Either way, the language of abandonment and divine departure can feel like a story of flight. The gods are not described as calm, seated rulers. They are described as leaving, turning away, or being absent at the moment they are most needed. Now you let a cinematic what-if settle like a blanket. What if the scribes, consciously or not, used shifting titles to represent a world where power is always moving, never safe? What if the divine assembly is portrayed as shifting, because people watched human assemblies fracture, relocate, and rebrand? What if the Anunnaki are on the run, in the sense that the idea of ultimate authority cannot stay pinned in one place, because history keeps pushing it? A third joke arrives, gentle. You imagine someone in the scribal school trying to memorize divine titles like they are passwords, and forgetting one mid-recitation. And the teacher's stare is so intense it could carve wedges into stone. Ancient anxiety is universal. You sit on a low step and listen to the city's quiet. Somewhere. A dog barks once, then settles. Somewhere. Water trickles through a canal gate. Somewhere. A scribe smooths clay for a new tablet. You breathe slowly, letting your mind accept ambiguity as a comfortable pillow. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The new development tonight is that the on-the-run mood can emerge from how names and titles shift, how collective labels move between domains, and how the absence of a divine assembly can feel like a vacancy in the highest seat of meaning. Not a solved mystery, but a sharpened question, pressed into clay, waiting in the dark for you to notice. You stand on a flat rooftop, under a sky so wide it feels like it has no edges. The city below you murmurs with late night life. But up here the air is cleaner, cooler, and filled with the quiet confidence of stars. A priest sits nearby with a small clay board and a stylus, not to write poetry, but to track patterns. He watches the horizon the way someone watches a pot that might boil over, patient, focused, slightly suspicious of the universe. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamian cultures taking omens seriously, especially signs in the sky and unusual events on Earth. Most historians agree that rulers and priests consulted omen traditions as part of decision-making, not because they were silly, but because uncertainty demanded structure. If you cannot control the river, you at least want a way to interpret the river. If you cannot predict politics, you at least want a framework for warning. And so the sky becomes a kind of sacred bulletin board. Now a new development slides into the Anunnaki on the run idea. And it is not about boats or titles or laments. It is about nervous interpretation itself. One interpretation is that the language of divine departure can rise in tandem with omen anxiety, as if the heavens are signaling that the usual guardians are stepping back. In other words, the run might be a mood created by a society reading danger into patterns, not necessarily danger that is confirmed, but danger that is felt. You sit on the rooftop and watch the priest's hands move. He traces a line from one star to another, then pauses. He looks toward the moon. He listens to the wind. It is not mystical in the movie sense. It is methodical. He has categories, expectations, archives of prior observations. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian scholarship built systems for tracking and interpreting signs. The systems evolved over centuries and were often tied to the needs of kingship and the stability of the state. A careful reading might suggest that when omen texts or omen-like narratives intensify, it reflects a society under pressure. People do not obsess over signs when everything feels safe. They obsess when they feel exposed. And in that exposure, the divine world can be portrayed as distant. The gods do not answer. The assembly is quiet. The highest powers feel unavailable. You hear a faint shout from a street below. Someone is laughing. Someone is arguing. Someone drops something metal and it clinks on stone. Life continues. But here on the rooftop, the attention is upward, and the attention has weight. The priest marks something on clay. It is a small act that feels like it matters. In mainstream terms, it is documentation. In interpretive terms, it is a ritual of control. In bedtime imagination, it is like writing a note to the sky and hoping it writes back. Now imagine how the Anunnaki fit into this. If the Anunnaki are framed as a divine assembly involved in judgment and decrees, then omens become the assembly's language. An eclipse could be read as a warning. A strange halo around the moon could be read as a signal. A bright planet rising at an unexpected time could be read as a shift in fate. None of that requires you to believe the gods are literal beings running down alleys. It only requires you to accept that the ancient world experienced the sky as meaningful, and that meaning could feel like urgent messages. Historians still argue whether specific omen interpretations were primarily political tools used by elites or sincere religious readings shared widely by the population. The answer may differ by place and time. But either way, omens shape behavior. A king might delay a campaign. A temple might increase offerings. A city might perform a purification ritual. anxiety becomes policy. You watch as another scholar joins the priest on the roof. They speak quietly, comparing notes. One points toward a bright object near the horizon. The other nods, then frowns. You cannot hear their words, but you can feel their tone, the way the night seems to lean in that tone. You can sense how a society might describe its gods as withdrawing, if the signs are bad and the rituals are heavy, and still the fear remains. Then it can feel as if the divine guardians have stepped away. Now the mystery spice returns, but with careful framing. A popular rumor claims that some ancient omen records hint at unusual celestial events beyond normal astronomy, like strange lights or objects that do not fit the expected patterns. This is the kind of claim that can be exaggerated, and it is difficult to validate from fragmented texts and translation uncertainties. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a bedtime what if. What if some observers saw something they did not know how to categorize, and described it with the language they had, which was divine language? Let me rephrase that more carefully. The solid ground is that the texts include observations and interpretations. The mist is turning those interpretations into modern ideas about visitors or chase scenes in the sky. We can enjoy the mist without falling into it. You lie back on the rooftop, hands behind your head, and you watch the stars drift. Your breathing slows. The priest's stylus keeps tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It is a soothing sound, like someone knitting fate in tiny strokes. Joke number 1 arrives softly. You think, if the universe really wanted to communicate, it could have at least used a font that does not look like bird footprints. But no, it chose maximum ambiguity, like a cosmic teenager. Now the on-the-run feeling becomes sharper in a different way. Consider that omen traditions often frame danger as approaching. A bad sign is a warning of invasion, plague, rebellion, famine. Even if the danger is not immediate, the imagination starts running. People begin to act as if trouble is chasing them. In that atmosphere, a text might say the gods have turned away, or the assembly is scattered. Not because the gods are cowards, but because the community is trying to explain why protection feels thin. One interpretation is that divine withdrawal language can function as a moral narrative. If the gods are distant, it is because the city has failed in some duty. Rituals were neglected. Justice was corrupted. The king was arrogant. In that reading, on the run becomes a spiritual diagnosis. The divine counsel is not fleeing a predator. It is distancing itself from impurity. A more cautious explanation could be that this is literary convention, a way to motivate repentance and reform. You watch the scholars consult a small box of tablets. They pull one out, compare a line, then set it back carefully. This is where you remember that these people built knowledge by accumulation, by copying, by comparing, by pattern recognition. The sky is a text, and the tablets are commentary. That is mainstream and deeply human. Now imagine a night when the moon darkens unexpectedly. People gasp, dogs bark, someone drops a basket. In the temple, priests light extra incense. On the palace roof, scholars scribble faster. The king hears and feels his stomach tighten. In that moment, the idea that the Anunnaki are on the run could be a poetic way to say, the highest powers are shifting, Fate is moving. The stable order is not stable. Historians still argue whether the social impact of dramatic celestial events like eclipses was mostly fear, mostly ritual, or sometimes even opportunity for political manipulation. Either way, the night becomes thick with meaning, and meaning can feel like pursuit. Joke number 2. You imagine the king asking, "Is the eclipse a bad sign?" And the scholar replying, "It depends," which is the ancient version of customer service. Not helpful, technically correct, and somehow still the only honest answer. Now the fringe lane opens briefly. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were once the source of stable cosmic administration, and that sudden ominous signs suggest they lost control or left under pressure. This theory isn't widely accepted. It often leans on modern storytelling instincts more than on firm philology. But, as a bedtime possibility, it adds a shiver of drama that stays PG and calm. What if the sky's warnings are not only about humans, but about a divine system under strain? You sit up and look at the horizon. A thin cloud passes. The stars dim for a moment, then return. The world feels normal again, and yet the memory of the dimming lingers. That is how omen thinking works. A moment becomes a message becomes a mood becomes a story. The new development here is that On the Run can be read as a society's collective nervous system. The Anunnaki are not necessarily running with feet. They are running as an idea, shifting in the mind's eye whenever the sky seems to warn of danger. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. To be clear, this is debated. The priest finishes his notes and sets the clay board aside. He exhales, long and slow, like he has been holding his breath for hours. The city below keeps murmuring, the sky above keeps shining, and you on the rooftop. Let your eyes grow heavy, listening to the soft tapping fade into silence, feeling the strange comfort of a world that looked up for answers, even when the answers felt like the gods had stepped away into the dark. Joke number 3 arrives as a whisper. You imagine the stars blinking like they are trying to send a message, but the message is just good night, and the priests spend centuries debating whether it means prosperity or doom. That is the universe for you, always dramatic, never clear. You walk into a city street where the mood is tight, like a rope pulled too far. The dawn light is pale, and instead of the usual easy noise of trade, there is a sharper rhythm of footsteps. Men carry bundles of reeds for repairs. A guard checks a doorway twice. A woman pulls her child closer as strangers pass. Nothing has exploded. No cinematic fireball. Just that familiar human sensation that something might be coming. And everyone can feel it without anyone saying it out loud. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian history includes long stretches of rivalry, conflict, and shifting power among city-states, along with periods of unification under larger kingdoms. The evidence we do have points to wars, raids, and political upheavals affecting cities across centuries. Archaeology suggests that destruction layers, fortifications, and abrupt changes in material culture sometimes align with these disruptions, though interpreting causes can be complex. In other words, the ground shows stress, but the story of why can be debated. And this is where a new development fits the on-the-run theme in a way that stays grounded. One interpretation is that phrases about gods departing or assemblies dispersing can be part of a literary response to war and political collapse. When a city loses, it is not only buildings that fall, identity falls. The patron deity's protection feels broken. The community's explanation can be framed as divine withdrawal. Historians still argue whether certain major turning points in southern Mesopotamia were driven primarily by outside invasions or by internal political fragmentation and resource strain. That debate matters because it shapes how you read the texts. If pressure is external, the language of flight feels like fleeing attackers. If pressure is internal, it feels like the city breaking apart from the inside. And the gods leaving becomes a way to describe loss of cohesion. You drift through the marketplace. Stalls are open, but the sellers' faces are watchful. A potter handles a bowl like it might be his last sale for a while. A grain merchant measures carefully because shortages make everyone suspicious. You see a small cluster of officials near the temple gate, talking low. One holds a tablet, another gestures toward the city wall. A third keeps looking toward the road, as if expecting dust clouds. Now the texts enter the scene like quiet witnesses. Royal inscriptions can brag about victories, and laments can cry about defeats. But between those extremes is the psychological reality of war, the slow tightening of fear. The evidence we do have points to ritual responses to crisis being common: increased offerings, purification rites, consultations of omens, public prayers. If the city is threatened, the city becomes louder in its devotion. And yet, some compositions describe the opposite. Not the gods descending to rescue, but the gods withdrawing. That contrast is important. It is possible that such language emerges when people feel rituals are not working, or when the political order has been decisively overturned. A more cautious explanation could be that literary conventions of lament require divine absence to create emotional force. Either way, the result is the same mood. The highest powers feel unavailable. The divine assembly feels scattered. You follow a procession moving down a street, not celebratory, but purposeful. Priests carry incense. Temple attendants carry containers of oil. A singer hums a steady tone to keep the group's pace. You notice how the pace is not fast. It is measured. This is not panic running. It is ritual urgency, the kind that tries to keep fear from turning into chaos. Joke number 1 arrives quietly. You imagine an official trying to keep the procession orderly and accidentally stepping in a puddle, then pretending it was intentional because nobody wants to look silly during a sacred crisis. Even in serious times, sandals betray everyone equally. Now the new development sharpens into a specific possibility. In times of war, sacred images and treasures could be removed to protect them or to prevent them from being captured. Most historians agree that in later Mesopotamian practice, capturing a city's cult statue could be treated as capturing the god, a symbolic domination. If similar ideas existed earlier in some form, then moving sacred objects away from danger could be described as the gods fleeing, not because they are cowardly, but because their presence is being safeguarded. The community might later remember it as abandonment, even if it began as protection. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We cannot assume every mention of divine departure equals a physical relocation. To be clear, this is debated, and evidence varies by text type and period. Still, it is a plausible lens in some contexts, and it fits the on-the-run feeling without needing anything supernatural beyond ancient belief systems. You approach the city wall. The mud brick is thick and sun-dried, patched in places where repairs have been made. Guards stand with spears, their posture calm but alert. Beyond the wall is flat land and a road that disappears into haze. A scout returns, dusty, breathing hard. He speaks to an officer. The officer's jaw tightens. The guard's grip shifts on his spear. Now imagine how a poet, later, would describe this. Not in plain military language, but in cosmic language. The enemy is not only soldiers. The enemy is chaos. If chaos approaches, the gods should stand firm. If they do not, the story becomes darker. A city lament might say the divine assembly left its seat. A hymn might ask why the high gods turned away. The Anunnaki, as a label for the high court, becomes part of the narrative of collapse. They are on the run, in the sense that order itself is retreating. A careful reading might suggest that some texts emphasize the gods' decisions as deliberate. They choose to withdraw. They choose to abandon. That can be moral framing, implying the city deserved punishment. But other texts can sound like the gods are overwhelmed, or that forces beyond human control have shifted fate. The difference matters. One makes the gods judges. The other makes them participants in a shaken cosmos. Now the mystery spice enters with the gentle warning label. A fringe idea proposes that ancient war descriptions, especially those with divine language, encode memories of conflicts that were not purely human, like battles among divine factions or cosmic powers. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often relies on reading poetic language as literal reportage. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a bedtime mood. What if the ancient writers used war as a metaphor for something even larger? The feeling that reality itself can fracture. You walk back into the city and find a small courtyard where a family is packing. Not wealthy, not dramatic, just practical. A man ties a bundle with cord, a woman wraps bread in cloth, a child hugs a small clay toy. This scene is simple, and that simplicity is the point. War, in mainstream history, often produces displacement. People flee not because they want to, but because they must. If the texts say the gods fled, it may echo the human pattern. The divine narrative mirrors the human experience. Historians still argue whether certain population movements in Mesopotamia were mostly forced deportations, voluntary migrations for economic survival, or seasonal shifts that later got remembered as permanent departure. Again, the causes are complex, but movement is real, and movement changes stories. Joke number 2. You imagine a goat being loaded onto a cart and refusing with theatrical stubbornness, like it is negotiating a better contract. The handler sighs. The goat sighs. And you realize that even ancient logistics had attitude problems. Now you step into a temple interior. The air is thick with incense. The walls are cool. A priest speaks a prayer that asks for stability, justice, protection. The voice is steady, but underneath it is a tremor, a human tremor. The evidence we do have points to religious practice being deeply woven into governance. Kings presented themselves as chosen. Temples supported economies, and ritual affirmed legitimacy. So when war threatens legitimacy, ritual intensifies. But if war wins, the ritual language can flip. Instead of presence, absence. Instead of blessing, withdrawal. Instead of a seated assembly, a scattered one. The Anunnaki, in this lens, become the symbol of a world that no longer feels overseen. You leave the temple and walk down a street where dust rises with each step. The sun is higher now, and the city looks normal at a glance. But you feel the tension in little details. Doors are barred earlier. People glance towards the gate. Conversation is clipped. The city is holding its breath. Now a cinematic what-if settles gently, like a soft cloak. What if, in the mind of a scribe, watching his city's defenses fail? The god's departure did not feel like moral punishment, but like leadership evacuating. The top officials are leaving the building. The lights are going off. The safe rooms are empty. It is a feeling you can recognize even in modern times. When institutions fail and people feel abandoned by those who were supposed to protect them. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That is a psychological reading, not a proven intention of any single ancient author, but it is possible, and it helps explain why the language of divine flight can feel so raw and urgent. Joke number 3 arrives softly, because humor is a life raft. You imagine someone carving a victory inscription and still misspelling a name, and another scribe quietly correcting it, like, "We conquered a city, but we cannot conquer spelling." Ancient pride, ancient typos. You pause near the gate as evening begins to cool the air. A messenger arrives with news that is not good, judging by the way his shoulders sag. The officials exchange looks. The guard captain gives a short order. The city prepares, not with screaming, but with a tightening of routine. People gather. Supplies are checked. Prayers are whispered. Some parts are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The new development tonight is that On the Run can be understood as a war-shaped lens, where divine departure language captures the emotional truth of political collapse, displacement, and the terrifying moment when a community feels the protective order receding. Whether the Anunnaki are a literal group of gods or a literary symbol of the highest authority, the texts can make them feel mobile, unsettled, no longer seated at the center. And that unsettled feeling, pressed into clay by careful hands, is the kind of clue that does not solve itself, but keeps you listening as the night deepens. You walk into a dim storeroom where the air smells like cedar oil, old linen, and the faint metallic tang of worked gold. The light is low, coming from a few lamps that tremble as if they are nervous too. Shelves line the walls, baskets sit in tidy rows. Everything here looks organized in the way people organize when they are trying to convince themselves the world is orderly. Most historians agree that temples in Mesopotamia stored valuable goods and managed resources, and that cult objects held deep religious significance. Archaeology suggests that many sacred items were crafted with remarkable skill, using stone, shell, metal, and wood, and that these objects often traveled through time in complicated ways, being repaired, replaced, buried, or removed. The evidence we do have points to the fact that the sacred was not abstract. It was handled, cleaned, dressed, fed with offerings, and guarded. Now a new development arrives in a very physical form. If the Anunnaki are described as leaving, dispersing, or being absent, one interpretation is that the story may be tracking the movement of sacred objects, especially when a community feels threatened. Not just statues, but standards, emblems, ritual vessels, tablets of authority, and seals. In this lens, the divine world is portable. The god goes where the symbol goes. The assembly moves when the institutional heart of the city is packed up. You watch temple attendants move quietly between shelves. One checks a bundle tied with reed cord. Another counts small vessels and murmurs numbers under their breath. A scribe sits cross-legged with a tablet, writing inventory. Tap, tap. The stylus presses wedges into wet clay. This is mainstream history as texture, the everyday reality of sacred economy. It isn't glamorous, but it is powerful because it is real. A careful reading might suggest that certain texts, especially those tied to crisis, focus not only on gods in the sky, but on the absence of the god's presence in the shrine. They mention empty temples, silent sanctuaries, neglected altars. Those details can align with a very human action, removal. If a statue is taken away for protection, the shrine becomes quiet. If treasures are moved, the storeroom empties. The city feels hollow. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not every mention of emptiness means a physical relocation. To be clear, this is debated, and literary genres often use emptiness symbolically. Still, the possibility matters because it turns the on-the-run idea into a grounded, almost logistical story. You step closer to a large bundle wrapped in layered cloth. The cloth is thick and clean, with a faint scent of soap and smoke. It is tied in a way that says, "Someone practiced this knot many times." Nearby, a wooden crate is sealed with clay impressions from a cylinder seal. The seal scene shows figures in profile, hands raised, maybe presenting an offering. The impression is crisp, and it feels like a lock you cannot pick. Joke number 1 slips in softly. You think the ancient world invented seals so nobody could tamper with goods, and the modern world invented passwords so nobody could tamper with accounts. And both systems still fail when someone writes the secret on a sticky note. Now you follow a procession forming in a courtyard. The attendants lift the bundles carefully, like they are lifting something fragile and alive. Priests stand at the front, holding incense. A singer begins a low chant, not dramatic, but steady, like a heartbeat. The chant is not only worship, it is a pacing tool. It keeps footsteps aligned. It keeps fear from spreading. Most historians agree that processions were important in Mesopotamian ritual life, moving sacred objects through streets during festivals and ceremonies. One interpretation is that in times of crisis, processions could become evacuations, using the same ritual forms, but aiming for safety rather than celebration. In that shift, the language of the texts can blur. A procession is still a procession. The god still goes out. But the reason is different, and the emotional tone changes from joy to urgency. Historians still argue whether certain ritual descriptions in surviving texts reflect everyday practice, special festival moments, or idealized literary portrayals that do not map neatly onto real events. That debate matters because it keeps you careful. It reminds you that a text can describe a perfect ritual even when the messy reality was different. Still, the idea of portable divinity remains a strong anchor in how many ancient societies behaved. You walk along with the procession as it moves through narrow streets. People step aside, heads bowed. A few whisper prayers. A child stares wide-eyed at the bundles and the incense smoke. You smell resin and warm dust. The city's noises fade behind the slow chanting. Somewhere, a dog trots along at the edge, not sure if it is allowed to be part of something sacred, but determined to try. A new development rises as you watch the faces of the people. The on-the-run mood can be communal. When sacred objects move, everyone notices. Even if the official story is festival, the body language can say fear. A woman grips her scarf tighter. A man scans rooftops. The guard's eyes flick constantly. And the text language that later speaks of gods departing can capture that collective memory. The day the sacred left the center. Now the mystery portion returns in a measured way. A popular rumor claims that certain sacred objects were not merely symbolic, but were thought to contain actual power, like a battery of divine presence. In mainstream terms, ancient people did attribute power to cult objects, though not in modern technological language. A fringe idea proposes that some objects were treated as devices of contact or control, and that moving them was like moving the command center. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often imports modern concepts into ancient contexts. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic what if. What if the fear around moving these objects felt like relocating the city's heartbeat? You reach a city gate where the guards open passage. Outside, the road stretches into open land. A few carts wait, their wheels creaking. The bundles are loaded with care. A scribe checks each item against his tablet. He is sweating, not from heat, but from responsibility. The last thing he wants is to explain to a temple administrator why an important emblem went missing. Ancient accountability is intense. Joke number 2. You imagine a missing item and the scribe's panicked whisper. Please tell me nobody left the sacred standard on the bench, which is the ancient version of forgetting your phone at a cafe. The carts begin to roll. The procession moves out. The city wall behind you looks solid, but the act of leaving makes it feel less protective. The landscape opens. Wind moves through grass. Birds lift and settle. The chanting continues. Quieter now, as if trying not to attract attention. What's broadly accepted is that when institutions relocate, the meaning of place changes. A temple is not only a building, it is a center of legitimacy. If its objects leave, the city can feel spiritually unmoored. One interpretation is that texts describing a city's abandonment by gods may encode the trauma of that unmooring. The people remember the moment the sacred left, and they narrate it as divine departure. You walk beside a cart for a while, listening to wheel creaks and the soft rattle of packed items. You glance at a sealed crate and wonder what is inside, but you do not open it. The mystery is better intact. You notice the guards' formation. They are not arranged for parade. They are arranged for protection. The difference is subtle but real. The on-the-run mood is in that formation. Historians still argue whether the removal of cult objects in various Mesopotamian contexts was more often a strategic protective choice by local elites or a forced action during conquest. The truth likely varies. Sometimes it is a choice. Sometimes it is coercion. Sometimes it is both. A choice made under pressure. A more cautious explanation could be that some stories of gods leaving are not about physical movement at all, but about changes in political patronage. A new dynasty promoting a new god, leaving the old cult neglected. In that case, the sacred might not move on carts, but it moves in attention. The offerings decrease. The festivals shrink. The priesthood loses influence. The god departs because the social structure that supported the god's presence collapses. Now, in bedtime imagination, you let the road feel like a secret route. The carts travel at night. The stars watch. The chanting becomes a whisper. What if the people feel like they are escorting not objects, but the very soul of their city? Trying to keep it alive somewhere else. Not proof. Not certainty. Just a calm, cinematic possibility. Joke number 3 arrives gently. You imagine the cart driver hitting a bump and everyone freezing, then relaxing when nothing falls, and the driver saying, "Sorry," as if apologizing to a god wrapped in linen. That awkward apology is the most human thing you can picture. The road reaches a small sanctuary outside the main city, a place with a low wall and a few trees. Fires are lit. The bundles are carried inside. Priests speak soft prayers. The scribe makes final marks on his tablet, then sets it aside to dry. The air smells of smoke and relief. People sit down, shoulders loosening for the first time in hours. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The new development here is that the on-the-run sensation can be traced through sacred logistics. The careful movement of cult objects that represent divine presence. When the sacred is portable, the gods can be portrayed as moving. When the movement happens under pressure, the language can sound like retreat. And you, listening in the dark, can feel how a cart's creaking wheels might echo inside a line of cuneiform that says, "In one way or another, the gods went out from the city." You step into a quiet workshop where the real drama is not swords or floods or processions, but a missing wedge, a broken corner, a sign that could mean two things, depending on how the light hits it. The room smells like damp clay and charcoal, and the silence is the kind that makes you hear your own breathing. On a low table, several tablet fragments sit on padded cloth, each one marked with tiny labels. A scholar leans over them with the patience of someone untangling a knot that has been tightening for 4,000 years. What's broadly accepted is that reading cuneiform is meticulous work, built on sign lists, grammar, context, and comparisons across many texts. The evidence we do have points to the fact that a single sign can have multiple values, and that damage can remove the very strokes that tell you which value is intended. A careful reading might suggest one translation, while another careful reading suggests a different one. Neither is lazy. Both can be honest. Now a new development slips into the Anunnaki on the run feeling, and it comes from the translation room itself. It's possible that a modern re-examination highlights rare verbs or unusual constructions that earlier readings softened or normalized. Some translators prefer a plain, conservative choice when a line is broken. Others are willing to keep the tension and ambiguity intact. If a text includes a verb that can be read as to flee in one context and to go out in another, the translator's decision shapes the story's temperature. Suddenly, the divine assembly seems calm, or suddenly it seems hurried. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This is not a claim that scholars are inventing stories. It is an acknowledgement that a translation is a chain of decisions, guided by evidence, but still made by humans with different preferences for risk and nuance. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You walk closer to the table. A fragment holds 3 lines that are clear, then a crack that slices through the 4th like a lightning bolt frozen in clay. The scholar points at the broken section and murmurs possibilities. You cannot hear the exact words, but you can feel the mental branching. Option A is a common phrase found elsewhere. Option B is a rarer phrase that fits the surviving marks but changes the mood. Option C admits defeat and leaves a blank. Now imagine the phrase, "on the run," as a modern headline hovering above this table. The scholar does not think in headlines. The scholar thinks in sign values. But a new decode can still happen, quietly, when someone notices a pattern across several texts. Perhaps a particular verb appears near mentions of divine assemblies during crisis genres more often than previously recognized. Perhaps a damaged sign once read as a harmless determinative is actually part of a verb. Perhaps a scribal habit, like writing a sign in a shortened form, was misunderstood and now gets corrected. Tiny shifts, big ripples. Joke number 1 arrives softly as you watch the scholar squint at the tablet under angled light. You think, this is the only job where staring at dirt until it confesses is a professional skill, and honestly, it deserves better snacks. The scholar brings out a magnifying lens and turns the fragment slightly. The clay's surface catches the light, and you see a faint wedge you missed. It is small, almost shy. That wedge changes the sign identification. And if the sign identification changes, the word changes. And if the word changes, the narrative changes. Suddenly, what sounded like "they sat" might become "they rose." What sounded like "they gathered" might become "they scattered." What sounded like "they went" might become "they were driven." The evidence we do have points to scribes using conventions that can be hard to spot if you are not trained in them. They used logograms, syllabic spellings, determinatives, and shorthand. They copied from older models. They made errors and corrections. Sometimes they even wrote glosses, like little notes inside the text tradition. Most historians agree that the scribal world was highly educated and conservative, but also capable of innovation. Now consider how this affects the Anunnaki. If the term refers to a divine collective, then context matters enormously. In one genre, the group might function as judges. In another, as a formal assembly. In another, as a poetic chorus of divine authority. A translator who expects one function might lean toward words that fit that expectation. A translator who suspects a different function might choose differently. This is not deception. It is the reality of interpretation. A more cautious explanation could be that the on-the-run mood comes from selecting a vivid translation option, where a more neutral option is also plausible. For sleep storytelling, vivid is tempting. But bedtime credibility is better. So you keep both options in mind. You let the vivid option colour the atmosphere, while the neutral option keeps your feet on the ground. You move to another table where a student is practicing signs on fresh clay. The student's wedges are clumsy compared to the ancient hand, but the effort is sincere. The teacher watches and corrects. A sign is slightly off. The teacher taps the clay, and the student tries again. You realize that many ambiguities in ancient tablets can come from scribal variation. Different schools favored different sign forms. Different time periods changed writing habits. Even a good scribe might press too shallowly when the clay is drying. That can leave a wedge barely visible, and 4 millennia later it becomes a debate. Historians still argue whether certain translation differences are mainly caused by genuine ambiguity in the ancient writing, or by modern scholarly traditions that prefer one reading family over another. That debate is part of the work, and it is also part of the mystery. Joke number 2 arrives when you notice a scholar's notebook filled with alternate readings and question marks. You think, this is the ancient equivalent of autocorrect. Except, instead of turning duck into something embarrassing, it turns divine assembly into divine sprint, and everyone pretends that is normal. Now you step into a different kind of decoding space, not the tablet itself, but the way texts are grouped. A new interpretation sometimes comes from realizing that a fragment belongs to a different composition than previously thought, or that 2 fragments join. When fragments join, they can change the meaning of a line by adding what comes before and after it. A word that looked like depart may turn out to be part of a longer phrase, like depart in peace, which feels calmer, or depart because of wrath, which feels sharper. The joining can also reveal who is acting. Is it the gods leaving, or is it the people speaking about them leaving? That shift changes the entire emotional weight. You watch a scholar place 2 fragments together like puzzle pieces. The edges almost match. There is a small gap, but the line spacing aligns. The scholar's face softens with the quiet joy of progress. Not fireworks joy, more like finding your lost sock joy. And honestly, that kind of joy is underrated. Now the new development deepens into something about our own modern minds. Sometimes. The most powerful decode is noticing how strongly we want a certain story. If you enter the texts expecting an alien chase, you will notice every word that feels like escape. If you enter expecting political theology, you will notice every word that feels like legitimacy and punishment. Both lenses can pick up real features, but both can also bias attention. The safest approach is to hold multiple lenses gently. So you stand in the translation room and practice that. You look at a line that could be read as the great gods withdrew. You also consider it could be the great gods were absent. You note that either can be emotionally intense. Depending on genre, withdrawal suggests intention. Absence suggests loss. Both can lead a listener to feel that the Anunnaki are not holding the center. Now the mystery spice returns, careful and labelled. A popular rumour claims that some scholars hide explosive translations to protect academic careers. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often misunderstands how scholarship works, with peer review, debate, and slow consensus building. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a bedtime what-if about human incentives. What if some vivid interpretations are delayed, not because they are forbidden, but because the evidence is too thin, and scholars prefer caution? Let me rephrase that more carefully. Scholarly caution is not censorship. It is a method for keeping mistakes from turning into myths, and mistakes are easy in cuneiform, because one missing wedge can flip a whole sentence. You move to a shelf of reference tablets, modern copies and sign lists. The scholar flips through pages of sign variants. The student listens. The room is filled with quiet authority. This is the mainstream anchor that keeps your story monetization safe and your mind calm. Real scholarship is patient, precise, and often humble. And yet, humility does not stop wonder. The more carefully you translate, the more you see how ancient writers used emotion and metaphor. They were not robots. They used language to create atmosphere. A city lament wants you to feel emptiness. A myth wants you to feel divine conflict or divine distance. So a vivid verb might be intentionally vivid. A phrase might be intentionally urgent. If an ancient author wanted an assembly to feel scattered, they might choose words that sound like scattering. That is literary craft. Now you step into a moment where a translator reads aloud two versions of the same line. Version 1 is calm. Version 2 is tense. The room listens. Nobody laughs, because this is serious. But inside your sleepy brain, you feel the gentle thrill of how stories pivot on tiny hinges. The Anunnaki on the run idea might be supported by the tense version, but the calm version remains possible. This raises the possibility that the real truth is not one line, but a spectrum of tone across many texts. Joke number 3 arrives quietly when you imagine ancient scribes watching modern scholars debate their wording. You picture a scribe shrugging like, "I wrote it on wet clay during a deadline. Please relax." And honestly, that is the most relatable ancient ghost you have ever met. The room grows quieter. The scholar makes a final note, then sets the fragment back on its cloth. The lamp flame flickers, and the shadows move across the wedges like waves. You feel how the on-the-run mood can emerge from translation emphasis, from fragment joins, from sign variants, from the human hunger for story. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. To be clear, this is debated. You let your breathing slow. You let the scholar's careful voice fade into the background like rain, and you hold one calm insight as you drift. The chase might not be happening in the ancient world at all. The chase might be happening inside the act of decoding, where meaning runs just ahead of certainty, always close enough to glimpse, never close enough to pin down. And that is exactly the kind of mystery that makes sleep feel deep and safe. You walk into a night market that feels half real and half dream, where lamps glow like small moons and every voice is softened by distance. People trade quietly, the way they do when they do not want to invite attention from anyone powerful. The air smells like cumin, warm bread, and smoke that clings to cloth. Somewhere, a musician plucks a stringed instrument, and the notes float up like slow sparks. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian stories travelled through many hands and many centuries, and that later audiences often reinterpreted older material through new fears and new hopes. The evidence we do have points to traditions blending, shifting, and sometimes being reframed in ways that make modern readers feel like they are seeing hidden layers. One interpretation is that some of the most dramatic Anunnaki on the run ideas arise from later retellings, modern imagination, and the way mystery theories grow when gaps exist. Tonight's new development is not in the clay itself, but in the way ideas about the clay spread. The on-the-run concept can behave like a rumor in a crowded street. It picks up speed, changes shape, and gains details that feel persuasive because they are vivid. A popular rumor claims that ancient texts contain coded warnings about cosmic pursuers, secret wars, or a divine evacuation plan. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often combines fragments from different times and genres into a single storyline. If we treat it as a possibility, rather than a conclusion, it becomes a useful case study in how humans build meaning when they want a coherent plot. You weave through the market and see a storyteller sitting on a low stool, surrounded by listeners. The storyteller's voice is calm, but the words are sharp. He speaks of gods and kings. He speaks of punishments and returns. He pauses at the right moments. People lean in. This is how stories survive, not only by being written, but by being told, retold, and emotionally tuned. Most historians agree that oral performance and written texts interacted, though the exact relationships can be hard to trace. A careful reading might suggest that even written compositions were designed to be heard, with repetition, rhythm, and dramatic turns. That matters because the on-the-run mood is partly an effect. A storyteller can make "they departed" sound like "they fled," simply by the way he paces the sentence. Joke number 1 sneaks in as you watch the listeners. You think, if someone had snacks, this story circle would be unstoppable, because humans will believe anything if you give them bread and a compelling voice. That is not cynicism. That is anthropology. Now you step into the space where mainstream history and fringe interpretation meet, and you keep the boundary clear. The solid ground is that Anunnaki is a term used in ancient texts for a collective of deities, with shifting roles across traditions. The mist is the modern claim that these deities were literal extraterrestrials, running from a larger interstellar threat. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki arrived from elsewhere, ruled, then fled when something stronger arrived. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence from mainstream translation does not require it. Still, it persists because it answers a craving for a single dramatic arc. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask calmer questions. Why does the idea feel so sticky? What emotional need does it serve? One interpretation is that people like stories where the powerful are not truly in control, because it mirrors modern experience. Institutions feel unstable. Leaders seem unprepared. The concept of gods being on the run is a mythic mirror of living in uncertain times. You leave the storyteller and walk toward a stall where an old man sells small clay figurines. Some are animals, some are humans. Some are rough shapes that could be deities or could be toys. You pick one up. It is cool, gritty, imperfect. The old man smiles like he knows you do not belong. But he does not care. He has seen stranger customers in his time. Probably. The figurine reminds you that ancient religion was not only big temples and official lists. It was also personal, small, and tactile. Now the new development becomes a guide for how to listen to mystery without being misled. You sort ideas into 3 gentle baskets. Documented. The texts exist. The signs exist. The cultures existed. The gods' names exist. Interpreted. Translations vary. Metaphors are used. Genres shape tone. And divine departure can reflect political or environmental crisis. Imagined. The chase scene. The cosmic pursuer. The dramatic escape. You can enjoy the imagined basket as long as you do not dump it into the documented basket. Historians still argue whether modern fringe interpretations are best understood as misunderstandings of ancient languages or as creative myth-making that uses ancient material as inspiration. Both can be true in different cases. Some claims are simply incorrect readings. Some are intentional storytelling. Some are a blend, where a small ambiguity grows into a big narrative. You stop at a booth where a young seller offers you a drink, thick and sweet. You decline politely because you're trying to keep the dream stable. The seller shrugs, unfazed. In the corner, a group of travelers whispers about dangers on the road. You cannot hear the details, but you hear the tone. The tone is the same tone that fuels both ancient omens and modern conspiracy threads. A sense that something unseen is moving. Now you let the mystery spice deepen for a moment, still labeled clearly. A popular rumor claims that there are missing tablets that would reveal everything, but they are hidden away. This theory isn't widely accepted. Museums and collections do have unpublished fragments, and scholarship can be slow. But hidden to protect a secret is a stronger claim than the evidence usually supports, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. It becomes a bedtime what if about the unknown. What if there are fragments that will one day clarify a line that currently looks like flight? Let me rephrase that more carefully. Unpublished does not equal suppressed. It often equals under-resourced, understaffed, and complicated by conservation. The mystery is often boring in the most human way. Joke number 2 arrives softly. You imagine a villain hiding tablets in a secret vault. But the real obstacle is a backlog spreadsheet, which is the least cinematic enemy imaginable. Truly the final boss of archaeology. You walk out of the market and into a quiet courtyard where the noise fades. A small shrine sits in the corner, with a lamp burning low. The flame flickers, and the shadows move. You think about how the Anunnaki on the run idea can be both thrilling and misleading. It is thrilling because it turns ancient texts into a thriller. It is misleading if it erases the real complexity of Mesopotamian religion and history. So you choose a balanced stance. Most historians agree that these texts reflect human societies negotiating power, nature, and meaning. One interpretation is that divine departure language reflects times of upheaval, when people felt protection was withdrawn. The cinematic what if is that the stories preserve a deeper panic, as if even gods were evacuating under pressure. You keep all three in separate pockets, like different coins, and you do not pretend they are the same currency. Now you consider another fresh angle. Modern decoding is not only translation, but media. A dramatic phrase spreads faster than a cautious paragraph. A video title that says "on the run" will travel farther than one that says "possible lexical nuance suggesting withdrawal in lamentation genre." That is not evil. It is human attention. But it shapes what listeners think the ancient world is saying. A careful reading might suggest that responsible mystery storytelling should keep reminding the audience when it is stepping into interpretation or imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. If something is fringe, we label it softly. That keeps the channel safe, your mind calm, and the story enjoyable without turning it into misinformation. Joke number 3 arrives like a whisper. You imagine an ancient scribe watching modern headlines and saying, "I wrote about the barley and taxes, and you turned it into aliens." Then sighing in a way that transcends time. You sit in the courtyard and listen to the night. A cat crosses the stones, silent and confident. A distant bell rings once, the air cools. You feel your eyelids grow heavier. The on-the-run idea settles into its most useful form. Not a claim, but a lens. A lens that highlights how ancient texts can portray divine authority as mobile, unsettled, and sometimes absent, and how modern minds can amplify that into grand chase narratives. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. To be clear, this is debated, and the calm truth is that you do not need certainty to enjoy the mystery. You only need honesty about which layer you are listening to. You breathe in, you breathe out. The lamp burns lower, the courtyard grows softer, and the story, like the market noise, fades into a comfortable hush. You walk into a wide, quiet plain just before sunrise, when the land is a soft grey and every sound carries. The grass is thin here, mixed with patches of bare earth, and the wind moves across it like a slow hand, smoothing a blanket. Far off, low mounds rise where ancient walls once stood. They do not shout their history. They simply sit, patient, letting time do what time always does. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian texts reflect human communities wrestling with leadership, ecology, and belief, and that divine language often expresses social realities in mythic form. Archaeology suggests cities rose and fell in cycles, shaped by water management, trade routes, and political power. The evidence we do have points to a world where writing was both practical and sacred, and where God served as the vocabulary for meaning in a land that could be generous one season and cruel the next. Now the final new development settles in, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a calm verdict you can hold without squeezing. One interpretation is that the phrase "Anunnaki on the run" works best as a summary mood for several documented patterns. Texts that describe divine withdrawal during crisis, rituals that move sacred presence through space, and translation choices that emphasize urgency in certain lines. None of this proves a literal chase. It does suggest that ancient writers sometimes portrayed the highest divine authority as not fixed, not always seated, not always available. And that portrayal can feel like flight when you read it with modern eyes. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The solid ground is that divine absence and movement are real motifs in Mesopotamian literature. The mist is turning those motifs into a single hidden storyline of cosmic fugitives. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You walk toward one of the low mounds. The soil is cool beneath your feet. You find a broken piece of pottery, smoothed by weather, and set it down again. This place has been handled by centuries, and it feels like the land itself has learned to whisper. You can almost hear the sound of a reed stylus tapping into clay, even though there is no one here now. Historians still argue whether the most dramatic divine departure passages in Mesopotamian literature should be read primarily as theological explanations for historical trauma, or as literary devices that intensify communal emotion. That debate is not a problem. It is the honest shape of ancient evidence. It keeps you from collapsing everything into one answer. So you take the balanced path across the plain. You lay out the story in 3 gentle tones, as if arranging stones in a small circle. Documented tone, people wrote on clay, scribes trained, temples and palaces managed resources, cities faced floods, drought cycles, political instability, and war. Sacred objects mattered. Ritual movement happened. Texts include laments, hymns, omens, and myths where gods appear, judge, withdraw, and return. Interpreted tone. Divine withdrawal language can reflect displacement, political collapse, moral narrative, or shifts in cult practice. The Anunnaki label can shift across time, sometimes functioning as a collective authority. Translation choices can emphasize urgency, absence, dispersal, or deliberation, depending on context and sign ambiguity. Imagined tone. The night sky becomes a stage, the plain becomes a corridor, and the divine assembly feels like it is slipping away from something unseen, not proven, not confirmed, but felt in the hush of a story told at bedtime. You do not force those tones into one, you let them coexist. That is the quiet skill of listening. Joke number 1 arrives as you stand on the mound and look out. You think, if ancient gods were truly on the run, they would still have to file the correct paperwork for leaving their jurisdiction. Because no civilization, divine or human, escapes bureaucracy. It is a comforting thought. Honestly, now you consider a final puzzle that keeps the mystery alive without turning it into a claim. If the Anunnaki are portrayed as withdrawing, what is the emotional center of that portrayal? A more cautious explanation could be that the texts are teaching something about power. Power can vanish, authority can relocate, protection can feel conditional. Even the most sacred institutions can fail to prevent loss. That lesson fits the human record, and it explains why the motif stays memorable. A fringe idea proposes that the motif hints at an external pressure that forced divine beings to retreat, like a larger cosmic order shifting. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the surviving evidence does not require it. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a bedtime shadow at the edge of the plain. You do not chase it. You simply acknowledge it is there, and then you return to the solid ground. Joke number 2 drifts in as you imagine someone trying to interpret a divine retreat and accidentally blaming it on the wrong god. Like me's tagging a friend in a photo. The offended deity would probably be like, "That was not me," and you would have to offer extra bread as an apology. Ancient social media problems, just with more incense. The sky begins to lighten. The horizon blushes faintly. Birds start calling in the distance, soft at first, then more confident. The world is shifting from night to morning, and the story shifts with it. You feel the chase dissolve into something calmer, a recognition that ancient texts often hold multiple layers at once, and that the most honest way to read them is to keep those layers separate. You walk down from the mound and follow a path that might once have been a road. The wind carries a faint scent of water. You picture a canal somewhere beyond sight, still moving, still doing what canals do. You find a small depression in the ground that could have held a wallpost long ago. You place your hand above it, not touching, just hovering, as if you can feel the absence. The absence is the point. The divine assembly being on the run can be reframed as the literature of absence, the way people write when the center does not hold. When life becomes unstable, stories become urgent. When the temple is quiet, hymns become pleading. When leadership fails, the cosmic leadership in the story becomes distant. That is not proof of hidden aliens. It is proof of human vulnerability, and that proof is strong because it repeats across cultures and ages. Historians still argue whether the emotional intensity of Mesopotamian laments is more reflective of specific events or of a broader cultural practice of ritualized grief. Either way, the grief is real. You can feel it even through translation, even through broken clay, even through time. Joke number 3 arrives gently, because you deserve a final smile before sleep deepens. You imagine a scribe finishing a dramatic line about gods departing, and then, on the next line, having to record something like 2 sheep delivered. And the tonal whiplash is so strong it could knock you off your chair. Ancient literature has range. Now the sun edges closer. The shadows shorten. The plain warms. And the story becomes quieter, softer, slower, easing you toward rest. You let your steps become lighter. You let your shoulders loosen. You let the idea of the Anunnaki settle into a simple, sleep-friendly shape. Not as villains, not as heroes, not as confirmed visitors, but as a name used in ancient traditions for a collective divine authority, sometimes portrayed as present, sometimes portrayed as distant. The on-the-run feeling, when it appears, can be read as a reflection of crisis, displacement, institutional movement, and the human tendency to describe uncertainty in divine terms. And now the wind down begins, like a long exhale. You lie down on the cool earth of the plain, as if the land itself is a mattress that has been waiting for you. The grass is thin, but it is soft enough. The sky above you is turning pale blue, but a few stars still hang there, reluctant to leave. You watch them fading one by one, not like a loss, but like a gentle closing of eyes. Your breathing slows. In and out. In and out. You do not need to solve anything tonight. You do not need to prove anything. You only need to let the mind rest in the space between what is known and what is wondered. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and you let both be beautiful. You imagine a clay tablet drying in early morning air. The wedges harden, the words remain, not loud, not demanding, just present. The scribe who pressed them is long gone, but the marks still hold a human handprint in their rhythm. You imagine the temple lamps going out as daylight arrives, and the city waking to routine again, because routine is how people survive uncertainty. The wind brushes your face like a slow hand. The birds call a little farther away now, as if giving you space. Your eyelids grow heavy. The plain stretches out, calm and wide, and whatever mysteries live in ancient texts can stay mysteries without harming you. The night doesn't have to end with a reveal. It can end with a softness. You let the last star fade. You let the last question loosen its grip. You let the story become a quiet hum, like a fan in the corner of your room, steady and safe. End of script. Sweet dreams.